Right, let's start by trying to understand what are requirements. Let's have a context reminder. When we are creating a software system, we're trying to move from a description that is vague and ambiguous into a computerized system, so code written in an unambiguous programming language. So in that, we need to make sure that the meaning that we choose to be programmed is actually what is properly intended by the customer. So in order to do that, we go through various stages of clarification and modeling. And the first stages here, the first group of stages is the requirements related stages, including the elicitation and analysis. So the software development lifecycle would look like something like this. There are a set of activities that aim at identifying what needs to be done. So these are the requirement elicitation and analysis. And there are a set of activities that aim to plan how are we going to do it. And then there's the implementation, that is the actual building of the system, and then the verification of whether it actually meets the requirements or meets what it's supposed to do or not. Now, a requirement, the old definition for a requirement was that it is a feature that the system must have or a constraint that it must satisfy to be accepted by the client. Now, that definition has proven to be infeasible and unrealistic given the uncertain nature of the software development. Now, the new definition that is more realistic and more feasible is that a requirement is a usable representation of a need. And when we say a need is just a problem or an opportunity to be addressed. So, a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be addressed. Now, that representation could be in a form of one document or multiple documents, but it can vary widely depending on the circumstances. Now, this definition is coming from the Business Analysis Guide. Now, as we mentioned, we discussed before that business analysis or a business analyst and a requirement engineer have a very similar tasks when it comes to, so the business analyst try to figure out, understand the business interest or figure out solutions for the business in general. This solution may or may not involve software solution. So when the solution involves software, then the overlap happens. Requirements engineer and business analyst are pretty much doing the same job. Now, the reality is that in software development, we can't really understand the details of the requirements until later on. So we cannot fully understand the requirements to the point that we can be certain it's going to be done. Also, it happens often that the requirements themselves can conflict with each other. So satisfying one requirement may conflict satisfying another requirement. Okay, and it is possible that we may run out of resources, that we have to figure out what is more important and what is less important, so that when we have to choose between the requirements, we have to have a consistent criteria to choose. So a common prioritization tool is called Moscow. So you just categorize your requirements in M, S, C, or W categories. So M for must-have. The must-haves, these are the real, I mean, the most important set of requirements. So without them, there's no system. Anything else has no value without these must-haves. Okay, so these are the most important requirements of the system. The should-haves are important requirements, not as important, not as essential like the must-haves, but they are still important. Only when you absolutely have to choose whether you implement a must-have or should-have, you choose a must-have. But should-haves are very important as well. Okay. Now, the ones that are not as important are the could-haves, or sometimes we call it the nice-to-haves. It's just a nice added value It's not necessary for the functionality of the system. It's not that important, but it's like a cherry on top. Okay, so when we are running out of resources, obviously the code hubs are the one that will be neglected. The won't have, the W for the won't have, these are the requirements that we deliberately decide that we're not going to implement or not going to elaborate on. It's not going to move on to the next stage. Now, why do we have a requirement if we deliberately not planning to implement it? Now, we don't know, like, this classification happened as a second stage. Okay, so we collect all the requirements that we can collect, and then we apply the prioritization that we have here. So we wouldn't know uh, before we collect the requirement whether it's going to be implemented or not. For various reasons, it may turn out that this requirement might be unrealistic to be implemented or not really that useful, or maybe it's just not suitable for this particular time. Maybe it will be reconsidered in the future. So we're not going to discard it altogether. It's just not going to be planned to be implemented in this stage or in this phase. Maybe in the future it will be considered. The requirement engineering, as we mentioned before, is the sub-process in the software engineering process, and it aims at defining requirements of the system under construction. There are two main activities in the requirement engineering: the requirements elicitation, that results in a specification of the system that the client understands. So the language of the output of the requirements elicitation is something that the client needs to understand. So we're not talking about technical documents here. The output from the elicitation process, not technical, it's not a technical document. Okay, it needs to be understood by the client to review. Now, the requirement analysis that comes after, that's when we start creating models and diagrams that is more technical. So these models are less ambiguous. So it would be more directed towards the development team or the design team. So when I say development team, I'm talking about the requirements, the design, and the implementation teams. So it can start to get technical at the analysis stage. All right, so if we want to relate this to the software development lifecycle, these two are what we are talking about here, the what, trying to answer the what question. All right, in the next video, we are going to talk about the types of requirements that we need to consider.